All right, we're going to start in on texturing basics. I think in the last tutorial we talked about working with materials and making stuff transparent, that kind of stuff. We didn't really apply any textures to our object or to our parts. So what we're going to do with this set of texture tutorials is probably break it up into 5 or 6 different videos. Try to keep the video lengths fairly short because there's so much stuff to cover with texturing. If actually building the 3D models is part of the equation, the other part of the equation is putting textures on that model, and I would say it's at least a 50-50 split. As far as 50% of your time is spent building the actual model, 50% of your time is spent actually putting textures on the model. And I've probably said this before, but you can build the nicest looking 3D model and then put crappy textures on it, and it just doesn't look very nice in game. Or you can build a crappy looking model and you can put great textures on it, and it can actually look fairly nice in the game. So the textures really are an important part of the process as far as making the textures on your own. That's a whole nother process that involves Photoshop or Paint Shop Pro or a program like that. So that's something that we can get into in the future, but for now we're just going to focus on putting the textures on the actual model, and we'll take a look at some of the things you need to know as far as basic texturing stuff. So here we go. So I've got just a basic box or cube structure up here so that we can kind of look at the 6 different sides that are available to texture a cube. Generally all your parts are going to have a top, bottom, left, or right. Maybe they'll have a front or back. It just depends on the shape of the part, but you'll see when we get into it a little bit what I'm talking about. As far as the actual texture I'm going to use, I've gone ahead and made a sample texture up for everybody to use. If you go to our website, the Military AI Works website, if you go to the Learning Center and you look for the specific thread on texturing basics, in that thread there'll be a downloadable texture bitmap file, BMP file that you can download, and go ahead and place that texture into your Flight Simulator 9/texture folder. Just go ahead and put it in the main texture, global texture folder, and that way it's easy to retrieve and you'll know where it's at, and we can reference that texture as we do the tutorials here. So basically, if we want to look at texturing here, the first thing we need to do is decide, okay, we want to texture this cube in this example. And you can get to texturing by going up here to the part menu, and then you can pull down to textures right here in the middle, or I like to use the shortcut key, which is F4. And so I'll spend a couple minutes talking about the part texture assignments box here and what all you can do with it. So anytime you're going to texture a part, and remember, for scenery modeling, you may have, I don't know, 5 or 10 parts for a given scenery model or whatnot, or a hangar or whatever. For an airplane model, it's not uncommon to have several hundred different parts. So if you think about it, each one of those parts has to be textured at some point, and you can see and maybe start to understand especially why the models, the aircraft models, can take quite a while to get the texturing. But scenery modeling is a little bit easier. On the texturing, the shapes are a little bit easier, so it's not quite as hard. So we've got the texture or the part texture assignment box up here in front of us, and you can see, you may or may not be able to see the mouse pointer here, but you've got a box to choose for the front of the part, to texture the back, the left, the right, the top, the bottom. Again, that's pretty standard for all your parts. It just depends on the shape of the part, and sometimes you're not going to have a top or bottom or left or right. Again, it just depends. And then you've got something down here at the bottom called wrapped, and you're probably not going to use wrapped very much, but if you think about it, if you think about a cylinder that's sitting on its end as opposed to on its side, you actually have the ability to wrap a texture around that cylinder so that it only textures, let's say, the long end of that cylinder. And notice that the wrap, if you can see it here, if you pulled this up on your version of FSDS, it'll ask you which axis you want to wrap the texture around, the X, Y, or Z. So in a case of a cylinder, if it's sitting on the ground, let's say, and it's pointing upwards towards the sky, and you wanted to wrap the long axis, that's generally going to be the Y axis, so it's defaulted to that. But just a caution, and this is something you guys can play with on your own time, if you use the wrapped texture feature, you can only apply texture to that axis. So if I wrap the Y axis, the long axis of a cylinder, I can't apply textures to either end of that tube or that cylinder. So just keep that in mind. I'm not going to get into that because I very rarely use that because it is limiting. It keeps you from texturing the rest of the sides of the actual part. So you guys can experiment with that on your own, see what you can use it for, but we're not gonna talk about that too much here. So I might as well get started here, and we'll just start with the front. And when you go ahead and first time you're going to texture a part, when you haven't assigned any parts to it already, go ahead and push the select button, and it'll bring up the texture list. And right now my texture list is blank, and that's because this is a new part, a new model. This particular saved FSDS file, if you will, it doesn't have any textures assigned to it. Now, if you go back into a project after you've already been working on it, you may have a whole list of textures already up here because FSDS will remember what textures you have already assigned to that project. So this texture list is where we'll go ahead and define or pick out the textures that we want our model to use. And basically the way to do that is go down here to the Add button. If I click on the Add, I have my version of FSDS set up to default to and look in my Flight Simulator 9 texture folder, that global texture folder where I ask you to put that the sample texture in. So I'm going to go ahead and click Add, and again it'll bring up a further menu, and in this case a texture definition box again, even though I think we got what part texture, texture list, texture definition. So in this box, if you know the name of your texture offhand, and I believe it has to already be in the folder that you're defaulted to, in my case the global folder, I think you can just go ahead and type it, but I've honestly never used this feature. I just go over here to Browse, click on the Browse, and then that'll bring up an open window, and in this case you can see up here, this is my Flight Simulator 9 texture, global texture folder here. So it already knows to default to that, and in this case I want to go, and this sample texture is called tutorial, so I can just scroll over here until I find it. And again, in your global texture folder there's going to be a ton of textures in here, so it takes a couple seconds to key in on it here, and there it is, tutorial. And when I click on it, okay, it's going to bring up a preview of that texture no matter what size, and you can see down here it'll say, okay, it's a BMP file. It tells me there's a warning about the format, and I'll explain that later, but 24 depth, bit depth, and its size of 10 by 24 by 10 by 24. And I'm not sure what this does. I think you can convert it at this time down to a 24-bit texture if you want, but I've never used this feature. The nice feature though is just showing you the little preview in the preview window here. So what I'm thinking is the idea behind this little preview window is just to make sure that is indeed the texture that you want. Maybe you have multiple textures named very close, but again it saves you from having to kind of open the texture within the folder structure itself and take a look at it. So this is the texture I want, tutorial. I'll go ahead and hit open again, and that now applies the name of the texture, the file name, into this texture definition window here. These special flag tags are, they do have a use, and we'll get into that later. Mostly you're going to use the night tag as far as scenery modeling. Perhaps for some aircraft modeling you'll use the reflect map, or the reflect tag. The light map alpha, and damage, those are all associated with actual user flyable type of flight simulator models. So I'm all happy with this. I'll go ahead and hit OK. And now we see, and hopefully you can see this on the video here, the name of our texture has now been added to my texture list. Now if I was working on a project and I knew I needed 4 or 5 different textures, I could go ahead and just add them all at the same time into this one single list. And very simply, do all that kind of stuff. So you can add them. If you go in here to edit, all it does is open this window back up and allows you to add the special flag tags, that kind of stuff. Change some of the other features. If you want to remove it, you can just click remove, and that will obviously remove the texture from the list. You can do a remove unused, and then the global rename. Again, those are features that you're probably not going to use too much. So I'm happy with tutorial. The test texture, or the sample texture, I'll go ahead and hit OK, and it will open up in a new window my texture. And in this case, the zoom factor is set to 100%, which is over here on the right hand side. You can see that. but this is only about a quarter of the texture, and you probably can't see it on the video, but you guys, if you're following along at home, down here again is a little preview window, and you can see a little kind of like a definition box or a diagram box that shows you what corner of the texture that this is in. So you've got some scrolling functions here where I can move the texture over left and right on the y-axis, if you will. I can move it up and down on the x-axis, and move it up and down on the y-axis. All right, so that'll help you navigate in and around your texture. If you would rather see the texture full size, you can start by going over here to your zoom menu, and you can start reducing it. We'll try 50% at first. This is a 10 by 24 by 10 by 24 texture sheet, the biggest size texture that Flight Simulator 9 can handle. So generally that's not going to fit in the normal window, but if I go here to 50% zoom, now the whole thing is in the window, and the actual quality of the texture isn't going to look very good as you start reducing the size. That's not going to affect how the texture looks on the model. It's just it's an artifact of how the texture gets previewed in this window here. So I want to spend a couple minutes just talking about some of the features inside the texture property box here, the menu here. Again, if you can't see the pointer at home or the cursor at home, that's just an artifact of the way the video is captured. But as I scroll around here, there's a box over here on the right below the zoom feature that will show you basically your x and y coordinates as far as that texture goes. So this is a 10 by 24 by 10 by 24 texture. And if I place my cursor exactly in the middle, that would be at 512 and 512, and so I can very precisely get there. So if for some reason you need to be at 512 by 512 at that point in your texture, that's just something to help you out there. The real big important things up here are going to be the enumerations or the numbers over here on the right side. Your X crop, your Y crop, your X size, your Y size, X tiles, and Y tiles. Now, when I want to put a texture on something and I have this box brought up, all I have to do is left click my mouse and just drag it, and that will open up this again, a texture definition window. You may or may not be able to see that on the video capture, but if you're following along, you can watch how this goes. So whatever I drag this to, and it's always going to be in a square shape or a rectangular shape, there's no way to avoid that. Whatever I drag this to, it's going to basically paste that texture onto that part of our part. And so in this case, we're talking about the front of the part. So whatever I define here in the box, it's going to go ahead and put that on the front of my model. Okay. The cool thing is, if you come over here and you look in these data blocks over here on the side, it's going to tell you some dimensions about your texture definition box, which is very handy when you're trying to do precise textures. You're trying to do the same exact texture pattern on multiple sides of a part. You can come in here and just recreate the numbers. So in this case, if I start here up in the very left hand corner and just draw the texture all the way down and cover the entire texture, you'll notice that it says the X size is 1024 pixels and the Y size is 1024 pixels. It makes perfect sense. If I want to do half the texture, again, I can start here up on the left, and I can just go to the 512 spot and get it fairly close to the 512, 512. So in this case, that would just give me a quarter of the texture. But here's the cool thing: I don't necessarily have to draw it with my actual mouse. I can just kind of leave it where I want it. I can go over here and I can edit the actual size by using the number pad. Whoops, I didn't need to do that. Hang on. Yes, this one again. Double click on that, brings it up back to 50%. Sorry about that. So the texture definition is still in there, by the way, as you can see. But I can come over here and I can make this a 512 by 512 texture definition just by punching in those numbers. And you probably couldn't see it on the video, but it actually does change the shape of your texture definition. Alright, and then if I want to crop it, that just means, do you want to move this texture around around your actual sheet. So by running the X crop up, I can move it all the way to one side or the other, and same thing with the Y crop, I can move it up and down. What you will find is that whatever textures, if I want to try to get this set of hangar doors here and I try to define the texture, you will find that FSDS you have to actually give it about a 1 pixel error. In other words, you have to draw your texture definition box about 1 pixel's width inside of the area that you want to show up. Otherwise it's going to bleed over and pick up some of the outer textures. And that's where using this X size and this Y size can be very handy, because you can actually reduce very precisely the size of your box by 1 pixel, 2 pixels, whatever you need to, just by clicking on these guys back and forth. So we'll get into this a little bit more later. I don't want to spend too much time on looking at this texture box. I want to get into actually doing something with the program tonight, as opposed to just sitting here and spewing out useless information. Alright, so when we started this exercise, we were working on texturing the very front of our cube structure. So what I've got on here on this sample texture are just all different kinds of textures that we can put on the front here. So just to get us started tonight, I'm going to choose this little garage door section right here. And again, because I'm on a 50% zoom, it's not very crisp or clear, so I'll go back to 100% so I can see the garage door nice and clearly. I'll go ahead and move it over here so I can actually see it. And again, I'll just draw my definition box around the garage door. And if I want to get it real precisely and get the exact corners of the garage door, I'm a little shy on the bottom here, so I'll make the X size a little bit bigger. There's 2 pixels bigger, and I'm a little shy on the I guess it's the X size over here. I guess it's Y down here, but X size over here. So I'll make the X, let's see, I'll have to make the X size probably 2 pixels bigger, 2, and notice it came off the edge over here on the right, but then what I'll do is reduce the X crop, and that'll bring the whole box back. Alright, so that's pretty much the entire size of that door, this garage door, which by the way is an actual garage door from, I think I took that out at Nellis Air Force Base maybe, and then made the texture from that. When I'm happy with the definition, I'll go ahead and hit OK. Come back to this box, and you'll get so sick and tired of hitting OK, 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 OK. We're back to our design window here, and we don't see anything, and that's fine. I just need to turn this guy around, and there is our texture on the front of our cube. So it's exactly as I defined the texture. Okay, and looks pretty good if that's what we're going for. Now, what I want to do is show you the different ways that FSDS will apply the texture to the surface based on how we define it. So I want to go back into the texture definition. So F4, again, why it goes through this whole process is just a pain in the butt. So yes, front. Now instead of going select and bringing up my texture list, I can just go to properties, because I've already defined that I want the front to use tutorial.bmp as the texture. So I don't need to select it again. If I had a different texture I wanted to use and change this and edit it, I'd go back in here, choose a different one, and go from there. But I already know I want to use this texture, so I can just go back to the properties window or box, and that'll bring up again your actual texture properties selection menu, and that'll save you a little bit of time from doing that. So I go back to my door here, and again it's encompassing, the definition right now is encompassing the entire door, and it looks basically just like you see it here on the screen. That's what it looks like on the cube as we've applied it. Well, what if I want to come in here and I only want to do half of the door? Okay, so the easiest way to do that is just take the Y size and start reducing that and running the number down, and I'm going to make it so it's only half of the number of window panes. So there's 3 rows and four panes in each row, so I'm going to do it so there's only 3 rows and 2 panes. Alright, and before I hit OK and you see what this does, just think about how FSDS is going to apply this texture. It's going to take whatever I define in this box, and it's going to plaster it or paste it on top or on that surface. So what I've done here is made more of a rectangular shape as far as the texture definition, but now I'm going to apply that rectangular texture shape to a square type polygon, or a square side of my part. So what you're going to see when we hit OK here is it's going to take this texture definition and it's going to skew it, and it's going to stretch it out a little bit. So let's take a look at that and see what that does. OK, OK, and now we've gone from that nice grouped set of 3 rows and 4 or whatever, 4 and 4 and 3 to this, just using the back and forth key here. So again, what it's done is that's the original texture. I have that texture. I took half of that, and so what it did is said, okay, he wants to take half of this texture and apply that same half of the texture, but he wants to apply it to that full side. And so what it does is it stretches the texture out so that it fits the entire side of the window. And we can kind of continue with this exercise just to show you how skewed you can get your textures by shrinking this down even more. So I'll just go back here to my Y size and I'll shrink it down now so it only covers one set of windows. And it looks good there. Okay, okay, and now you can see it's actually stretched the windows out even more. So this can be annoying or this can be useful depending on what you want to do. Maybe you want to, maybe you only have a texture sheet that has one set of windows on it that you can use. Well, you can actually stretch it out. You can make the windows look different. You can apply them in different directions. Just based on what you might be trying to achieve. So while it seems like it's counterproductive, there are reasons you might that you might want to stretch a texture, and I'm going to show you that here in just a second. All right, so we're looking at how the program is going to apply a texture to each side of the part, and that's kind of like wrapping your head around the three design windows and the XYZ axis. You kind of have to wrap your head around how the program will actually apply a flat texture to a part. Now we're working with a very a nice square cube here that has nice flat surfaces, but trust me, when you go to start applying textures to curved surfaces like a cylinder or a complex shape or a curve on an airplane, you can get some pretty weird looking textures. They can stretch in kind of odd different directions, and usually there's ways to work around that, but it can be very frustrating. So let's take a look at some different examples here now that we've seen that we can stretch this. And again, that was kind of the middle result, and then that was the result with the full texture. So if I go back to my texture window, F4, again, I want to stay with tutorial texture file. I can just go back to my properties since I've already chosen this one. Let me get zoom back down here so we see what else we have here. Alright, another interesting thing is, let's say I want to apply this Thunderbird's symbol to the front of my flat cube. And okay, the cube is a square shape, and this Thunderbird symbol is obviously not. It's a round shape. So if I go ahead and make this definition box as close as I can to each edge of this object, and again I can use my crop features here to kind of snug it up, which is where this is a really useful tool. It looks good there, and I hit OK. Think about what it's going to do. Okay, we're going to get the round part, but we're also going to get the black parts on the edges here as it applies to the front of this. Okay, which you see here. So if you want to put a round symbol like that or something on the front of a flat object like this, you have to get a little more creative with it. You can fix that with a different kind of texture, or there's different ways you can make a round medallion type shape object and you can texture that. But there are all kinds of ways to go about doing this stuff. But again, I'm just trying to cover some different theories or some ideas of some things we can do as far as placing these textures on these objects. So I want to look at a couple different things here. We've kind of looked at a basic flat door kind of thing. That's pretty easy. A lot of these are just very straightforward door type structures. We looked at how it would stretch the texture up and down kind of in the y-axis. Well, think about what's going to happen if I define this row of numbers here. I select the whole thing, the whole 1024 pixel width. Alright, and I apply this very elongated strip of numbers, and I apply that to a nice flat shape. Kind of think about ahead of time before I hit OK what it's going to do. If you think about it, it's going to try to squish that set of numbers down, which look nice and evenly spaced out here on the texture. It's going to squish them down so that they fit on the flat surface. So let's just see what happens. We hit OK, OK, and there you go. It tries to fill, or it doesn't try, but it actually fills the entire front surface of this cube with the texture definition that it has to work with. And in doing so, you've squished your numbers down so that they look nothing like what you have on your texture sheet back here. So again, when you're applying your textures, you have to think about, okay, what what is the shape of the polygon that I'm applying them to, or the side that I'm applying them to, and what is that going to do to the actual overall texture. And that's where you're going to get frustrated, and it's a learning process that takes place, and eventually you'll figure it out. But it's one of those things that as you figure out and start to learn things, and you start to make your own texture sheets, your own bitmaps, that you'll start to figure out ways to cheat the system a little bit, or ways to make things work for you by designing the textures on the sheet so that they turn out correctly on the part. And what I actually tend to do quite a bit is when I make scenery models, a lot of times I will make the model, the 3D model, and at the same time I will create the texture to go along with it. So I'll have FSDS open in one window, I'll have, in my case, Paint Shop Pro open in the second window, and as I get working on the structure, on the model, I'll realize I need a certain kind of texture in a certain way on the texture sheet. I'll go back over to Paint Shop Pro or Photoshop or whatever you're using, and I'll create that texture on the texture sheet, save that file, and then I'll go back into FSDS and then pick that new file up, which is a neat feature of FSDS, is if you save a new version of your texture file, go back into FSDS, it will recognize that new texture file right away. So that can be a very handy thing to do.
Alright, so we're still talking about the very front side of this cube, or the front face of this cube, and how we can apply textures to it, and what happens when we apply a given texture shape or a given texture definition to the front square shape of this cube. Now I want to look at a couple features, the tiling feature, for example, and then I want to also show you how we talked about earlier when the program takes your texture and it stretches it out. Sometimes that's a good thing, and you can use that to your advantage, and sometimes that's not a good thing, and it's causes some problems. So first thing I want to do is show you how that can actually be to your advantage. And what I want to look at is this top portion of the texture sheet here, which is kind of this tan colored corrugated steel. There's like a whitish tan and a more tan version here, but a lot of hangers that you're going to design have this kind of this corrugated steel look to them, and there's a very easy way to apply that texture to your shapes and not have to have an entire 5x12, 512 by 512 sheet of that texture. So because we're going to use the way that the program applies that texture to your part to our advantage. So in this case, let's take a look at if I just select a little bit of this texture up here, maybe about half of it, and again we already talked about it's going to apply this entire texture that I defined to the front surface of the cube. And my texture definition here is a very narrow rectangle shape, but I have a square surface or square flat surface on my cube. So again, think about how it's going to apply this. We'll hit OK, and we can see when I flip this around here that it actually applied that little slender piece of texture. It actually applied that vertically down the entire face of our part here, the front of our part. So in this case, if I squish this up a little bit in one of the axes here, whoops, go that way, you can almost see this as the sidewall of a hanger. So the neat thing is, if I go back to my texture here and we look at it, I don't necessarily have to make it an entire giant sheet of textures. And remember, if I zoom out here, we'll see that this little texture is just essentially a small sample across the entire width of the texture sheet, and I'll show you why I did it across the entire width here in a second. But this is an example of where the program, when it applies your texture to your model or to your object, and it stretches it out and covers the entire surface, this is an example of where that can actually work to your advantage. So you'll probably see a lot of hanger designs that I've done, a lot of other hanger designs that other people have done. You can actually get away with very small pieces of texture on your texture sheet and actually use that kind of use that characteristic of the program to your advantage. So, and again, notice with the part here, it basically took whatever I defined as the texture definition and it applied that to the actual piece. And in this case, it actually looks fairly good, like the corrugated siding that we're after. Now, if I go back in here to the definition and I go ahead and just define or make my texture box across the entire width of the texture sheet, again, the easiest way for me to do that is just come down here to the X size and just make the X size 1024. Now think about what it's going to do as far as applying that texture. It's going and it's going to apply the entire width of this texture definition to that what is relatively narrow part. And so you'll see when it comes up that it changes the look of it quite a bit. In fact, it's it's almost hard to kind of see. It may not really show up in the video capture very well, but you can kind of see what I'm talking about, where it's gone in and squished the textures down by basically applying the entire width of that. So again, we can use this to our advantage as well. So if you want a real narrow texture or real narrow gap, essentially in the look of your texture, you can go with the entire width of the texture sheet. If I don't want something so narrow, I can come back in here to my properties box. Let's say I want the gap and the width and everything to look twice as wide. If I want it to look twice as wide, I'll just define half the texture, or half the width of the texture, which is 512. Okay, and that brings it back to something that looks a little bit more realistic, in my opinion. Okay, and you can continue to do this down to whatever number you want to use. And again, instead of me going back in here and trying to define it with a texture box, I just go over here and define it with a number, which is just an easier way to do it. So this is 100 pixels wide, and let's see how that looks. So you can kind of see what I'm getting at here, that you can control the look of your texture just by simply making it wider or taller or vertically higher, and using that to your advantage. So I'm going to take this part, and I think I can stretch it in the x-axis in the preview window. No, it's not going to let me do that. So get out of the preview window, and then let me stretch this wide. Let me show you the next example of what we're going to do here. And when I bring the part back in, that's probably too wide. It's going to really look bad. Notice the part it's still trying to apply that same texture definition, that same narrow 200 pixel wide texture definition. It's still trying to apply that to the entire width of this particular part. And again, by making the part wider in this case, or stretching it in the x-axis, we've kind of forced the program to apply the texture in the way that we've told it to apply it, which is 200 pixels wide. And now you can see it actually really zooms in. You can start to see the individual pixelation of the dots of the colors. And in this case, it doesn't look very good. So if I want to fix that, I can go back in here. Let's give it the entire width of the texture sheet. So let's go, instead of 100, let's go 1024 again, and this should look a little bit better on this particular piece, and you can see it does. It looks a lot nicer. Okay, but what if that's the width of my part, and that's the width of my texture definition, and that's all I've got? 1024 is all the wider I can use in Flight Simulator 9. What if I want more than that? What if I want these these look like a little bit too wide as far as like a corrugated steel look? So there's a way you can actually increase the number of times that this texture is applied to a part, and that's the tiling feature. So if we go back into F4 texture definition, go to properties. I'm on computer, there we go. You can see down here you have X tiles and Y tiles, and what this basically will do, an X tile will take whatever X stretched in the X definition that you've already defined. It'll take that and multiply it by any whole number. But here's the catch: you can't use, and let me zoom out here, you can't use just part of the texture. So if I just define part of my texture here, and I'll do more than one so we can see the difference, and then I try to use, let's say, 4 tiles of it, let me show you what happens to the texture out here. It works in this case because it's the same thing, but I guess what I'm trying to tell you is you have to be careful about trying to tile it with just a little section. So this is the same texture all the way across. So what it's doing is basically grabbing, let me go back to the properties menu here and show you with the cursor. It's basically grabbing this definition right here, if you can see it. If not, it's the box is basically right in this area. It's going to take that and it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4 across. So in this case, it's the same. It looks exactly the same. Probably a better way to show you this is to define it down here so that you can see that it's actually gonna do a little bit different texture each time. So let me put it in here and see what happens. Yeah, and this is what I'm talking about. See, it's taken that same, whatever that was, 300 pixel wide or whatever, and it's tried to multiply it once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and what you end up doing is you end up getting all the residual stuff that's on that side of that texture sheet. So if we go back and look at it, and we widen it out here, you get this box up here, which was your original texture definition. That's your first one tile. Second tile would be here, third tile would be here, fourth tile would be here. Okay, so up in here in this example it works because it's the same exact texture all the way across, but down here that's not going to work. Okay, and the same principle goes for the Y tiles. If you have a texture definition up and down, it's going to do the same exact thing. It's going to try to go 1, 2, 3, 4 up and down. So the reason I designed this texture sheet like this with this this corrugated steel all the way across is so that I can take advantage of the way that it tiles and the way it kind of picks this up. So what I want to do, and really only way to take true advantage of this, is to define your texture all the way across. So 1024 wide. Okay, and let's start with let's just start with 1 so we can see how it looks, and then I'll show you how it looks as we change the tiling. So there's that 1, looks fairly normal. Let me go back and let's add 2, which will essentially double the width of the texture sheet. So we'll go in here and we'll add 2, and what you should see is that the gaps get a little bit smaller and it looks a little bit closer to what a corrugated steel thing would look like. Okay, so you see the change there, how it kind of came down with 2 tiles. I can do this, I don't even know what the limit is. It goes over 100, 500, I don't know what the limit would be, but you can use this to your advantage to get your texture looking a little bit closer to the way you want it to look. So that's twice the tiling. Let's do 4 times just to see what that looks like, and then again it's going to make it look even more compact. Okay, so that's what tiling is, and again you can do that in the X or the Y direction, but just be careful if you're planning to use tiling, which I normally do a lot of times on my models to get it to look right. I will go ahead and on purpose in these texture sheets I will build them so that I have a strip of texture like this corrugation texture. I will build it all the way across the entire width of the sheet, knowing that I'm going to come in here, I'm going to define the entire width, and then I'm going to multiply that using the tiling feature by 1, 2, whatever, 3 times. And so when you have a fairly large hanger model, for example, being able to tile it is a very nice way and a very quick and effective way of getting the look you want without having to actually come in and design multiple different sizes of siding textures into your texture sheet. So far we spent probably 30 or almost 40 minutes now talking about how to texture just one side of this cube part. So again, I hope you can get an idea of how complex this can be and how much information there is to pass along, but we're kind of getting there. What I want to do now is I want to texture all 6 sides of this cube with this same exact texture definition, and I want to show you how, depending on how the axis of the part is aligned, how it will actually apply the textures. So let me go into my texture definition. Again, I've already selected tutorial, so I don't need in this top or this front view to select it again. I can. I'll just bring up this menu again. I'll select it. And again, whatever texture definition I had in there previously is going to still be there. So what I want to do is pick out a part of this texture that we can look at and see the differences. So what I'm going to do is just go down here to this little quadrant of numbers, and I'm just going to choose it and apply it to all 6 sides so that we can see the differences as it gets applied, and so that it looks relatively the same. I'm going to note the numbers over here in the data blocks as far as the X size and Y size and the crop sizes, so that I can just type it in the next time. I don't have to go and keep doing this definition. Alright, so that looks pretty good. 644, 616, 187, 194. If I can remember those 4 sets of numbers, and sometimes I have to write them down, I'm just going to use that. So 644, 616, 187, 194. I'll hit OK. Without even looking at the back, I'll just come back in here, select it. And I think we said 644, 614, 194, 184 maybe. I can always go down here and double check it. See how bad my memory is here. And it's a little off, so I can just go ahead and redraw it here and see how close I can get. So it was obviously 644, 617, 188, 194 I think is what it was. Close enough. Alright, so I'm going to go and I'm going to do this for all 6 sides real quick.
And I can't even remember my numbers. It's been a long day at work. So we'll just go ahead and just draw the definition out myself. And again, this is where you can kind of start to see how long some of this modeling takes. It's not so much building the model, but it's applying the stupid textures to the sides. It just, if there's 6 sides per part, for example, that's 6 sets of textures you have to apply, and so on and so forth. And again, the scenery modeling really isn't that bad compared to the aircraft modeling, where there's a lot more textures to worry about and to apply. So that's why some of these models can take over a year to get done. There's just so much work to do on them. So we are 4 sides here. We'll do the top and the bottom last, and we'll see how this looks here in a second. And then we'll manipulate the part axis and show you how we can actually kind of make everything line up, or at least try to line up. So we'll get one last definition. That one's not my greatest. So again, this is a case where if you remember the numbers off the top of your head, what we said, 644 something something something, you can just type the numbers in as opposed to having to go down here and redraw the texture definition box every single time. All right, so here's the bottom side. We're looking good. We'll hit OK. We'll hit OK, and we've got our cube now with textures, or it almost kind of looks like a pair of dice. But notice all the up and down sides. So the front, the back, the left, and the right. Those are all applied exactly, as we saw the texture. And then we go up here to the top in the bottom, and it looks to me like the bottom went on the way we wanted it to. The top went on backwards. Okay, so that this is another issue you're going to have to deal with. And notice also here, if we're trying to be really precise, notice that the midlines of these textures do not line up. Okay, they don't line up here. They don't line up there. And if we're really trying hard, notice on the vertical sides they line up perfectly. Because again, it's basically been stretched, not quite perfectly, but it's there's not too much stretching involved in that. But as far as getting it to look right, that side lined up very well. Actually, I did pretty good here. But we can see this side here, my texture must have been off by quite a bit. All right, so if I can figure out what side this is, and there's really not going to be a way to figure this out without undoing some of the textures, but I can fix this, and the way to fix that is just by making sure that my texture definition for this side matches that set of numbers for every other side. Okay, but my point in doing this exercise is to show you that the way that the textures went on the bottom here, went on one way, the top went on an opposite way. So for whatever reason, if you have to work with this, you can fix this. This isn't the end of the world here. And I think the easiest way to fix that is to go in here and show you one last little feature of the texture definition. I'm pretty sure that's the top side of my structure, of my cube here. So I can go back to F4. Okay, I can select the top one here. I can go to Properties. Okay, and it looks like I just need to flip the texture upside down. So what I can do is I can use this Invert X or Invert Y selection, and that will invert the texture. In this case, I want to invert it, I believe, in the Y. So let's check that. Let's hit OK. Let's go back. And okay, that did not do what I wanted it to do. It made the texture backwards. So let's go back and try to do it the opposite way. Let's try Invert X, and maybe that'll take care of it. Invert X will leave the Y alone and hit OK. We may have to do both. We'll see. Alright, well, it's better. And I think, let's see, I think if I go back and try to invert the X now, that it will, maybe it'll work. May not be the best example. Sorry, Invert Y may not be the best example I could have chosen, but you kind of get the point. There we go. So I had to flip the texture from top to bottom. I had to flip it from left to right to get it to look right. Okay. And now I'm happy with my little cube here, and this is the final exercise we're going to do in this first video tonight, because it's been a long day at work and I'm getting a little tired, but this is a lot of stuff to absorb and a lot of stuff for you guys to play with. And since you have this exact texture sample to work with, what you can do is in this, where I've dorked this up here, and I've got the alignment a little bit off here on this this side. You guys can actually go back in there and fix that and work on that on your own. So that's just a look at one simple cube. That's a look at some very basic stuff with the texture definitions tonight. In the next video we'll get into a little bit more advanced stuff. We'll show you how to texture one part with multiple different textures and do all kinds of fun and crazy stuff by breaking the part up into different pieces and whatnot, and then reattaching it and all kinds of fun stuff. So again, come see us in the forums if you have questions. I would assume there are going to be questions about texturing, because it is such, I don't want to say it's complex, but it can be a bit complex, and it can be a bit overwhelming and daunting as far as making the textures, applying the textures, learning little tricks. We haven't talked about transparency and using alpha channels and all that kind of fun stuff yet. So just all kinds of stuff to work with here, and eventually we'll get back and we'll texture that hanger that we built a couple lessons ago, and we'll show you some of the tricks from there. So come see us in the forums. If you have any questions, just let us know. We're happy to help, and hopefully we'll get the next video here in this series made fairly quickly so we can kind of string these all together. And that's it. Folks, have a good night, and we'll talk to you next time. Alright, so there's two more little features I want to look at real quick tonight that have to deal with texture applications, and some shortcuts you can use. Or going to be times when you're going to want to use these features, just depending on what you're designing. So the first thing we'll look at is the invert feature on the actual texture definition sheet, or the texture definition box. So let me pick out for the front side of this, which I think is over actually around here. Let me pick out a texture for it. Again, I don't know why it dropped out there. Let's do the numbers so that we can easily see the results of this tonight. Over here, let me get my numbers. And okay, and whoops, missed the front side. There it is. Okay. So there's the front of our object, or front of our part, 1, 2, 3, 4 texture, just for an example. Now if I want that to be applied backwards for some reason, okay, if I want it mirrored for whatever reason, maybe you're trying to mirror the front side to the back side, whatever, you can actually do that two different ways. The first way, the easiest way, is to come back into your texture definition, select properties to get your texture definition sheet, or as they call it, the texture property sheet. And you've got, don't worry about this transparency, that actually has to do with this box here, but you've got invert X and invert Y. And so basically, if you check the invert X tick box, you're telling the program to go ahead and apply that texture, or invert the way that it applies that texture to apply it in the opposite direction. So if we hit OK, we should see all of our numbers backwards. Okay, so they're all backwards. All right, if I want to invert the Y, that'll put the 1 and the 2 on the bottom, the 3 and the 4 on the top. So I can do both at the same time if I want. And again, there are going to be all different kinds of situations when you may want to use this technique. Okay, and there we go. Okay, so you can actually flip the way in that the texture is applied. So let's say, a good example is that corrugated siding we've been working with all night. If you want it to go horizontally instead of vertically, you can just, well, I guess you can't. Let me see. You'd have to flip. Well, let's try. I think you could get away with flipping the axis, and maybe not. We may have to rotate the axis, which is what I'm going to talk about next. Let me put it on here, and let's just see what happens here. Let me undo my inversions here, or my flipping, so that we can see what it should look like. That's what it should look like. All right, now think about this. If I invert, because of the way this, this is a good example. Because of the way this texture is already drawn on the texture sheet, if I come in here and I invert it and I flip it so that it puts that exact texture on backwards in both the X and the Y, you're not going to notice any change whatsoever, because it's the same texture up and down and left and right. So if I put the left and right on backwards, it still looks like it did, except this little darker gap right here is on the opposite side of the cube. If I undo that, you can see it flips over to this side. I'll redo that so you can see. So it did go on backwards, but as far as up and down, the y-axis, flipping it, it's not going to make any difference whatsoever. So in this example, let's say I want to use that texture definition, or that piece of my texture sheet,
but you know, I want to apply it to this part, and we'll say for this example, this is a building, and I can't rotate the building on its side. I can't rotate the part on its side because it's going to have other textures on it. It's going to have a roof texture on the top. I just, you know, I can't get away with that. So there is a way to get the in this case the siding to apply horizontally versus vertically without having to redefine a texture in your texture sheet. And the easiest way to do that is just to rotate the actual part axis. So it's always the program's always going to apply the texture based on where your part axis is and the orientation of where that part axis, or the orientation of the actual axis. So in this case, everything's normal. Y is up and down, X is left and right, Z is forward and backwards, so everything's normal. If I come in here, I press R on the keyboard for rotate, and remember from the very first set of tutorials, if I just want to rotate the part axis, not the part itself, I hold down the Shift key, and then I rotate it using the mouse, and in this case, we'll rotate it 90 degrees. Oops, that was a little too much. Well, let me undo that. I'm a perfectionist. Everything's got to be perfect for me here. There we go. Okay, notice up here, everyone right now is thinking I'm a liar because nothing has changed up here, and that's because we haven't basically redefined the texture now with this new part axis orientation. So all I have to do to get it to apply the texture now with the new orientation of the axis is just go F4, and I don't even have to go back in here to the actual texture sheet. I can just hit OK again, and when I hit OK, you're going to see that the textures are now applied horizontally as opposed to vertically. And there you go. So without having to rotate my part, I've now rotated the axis, or rotated the direction in which the textures are applied. So don't forget when you do this, when you change the axis of the part here, that affects the entire part. So if I were to put this same texture definition on all the sides, it's going to essentially wrap it. So yes, hello computer. There we go. A little slow tonight. I don't remember exactly what the number was. I could get the number from the first texture definition, but I'm a little bit lazy. And let me just do the front, back, left, and right just to show you what I mean. And it's basically going to wrap the texture all the way around. And it should be off a little bit because I'm not using the exact same width of texture definition for each of these sides. And we'll show you how to fix that real quick as well. Alright, so close enough, and you should see it's basically the texture is applied in the, let's see, that's probably the two sides there. Boy, I'm having all kinds of problems rotating my box here. Okay, so stop. Front and back and left and right are these sides down here. So I don't know if I did it right or not. We got it to work right in one direction, but my point is notice what's going on here is now the texture's all messed up because I didn't do the top or the bottom. Okay, so you can have issues with this, I guess is what I'm getting at, when you go to apply it in the direction that you want, just by simply changing the part orientation or part axis. Now, another interesting thing we can show you real quick is if I restore the axis rotation, and then I will move the part axis, that also affects it. So right now the part axis is exactly in the center of the part where we want it. So I can use the move feature M, and again hold the shift key down just to move the axis. So I'm going to move it down here into the corner. And for our part here, if I redefine the texture, it's not going to change anything. Again, we're working with, although it did fix the top and the bottom deal there. That was nice. It's not going to change anything because it's the same texture definition all the way across. There's no variation in it. It's just it's a repeating texture. But if I come in here and I give it, let me clear out these other guys here, and I give it a slightly different texture definition, it's probably going to change the way it looks. Let me try this shape here and see if it does what I think it's going to do. My point here is to get you thinking about it. Just remember, it's always going to apply the texture based on, no, it didn't do it in this case. There are going to be times though when where the axis is sitting in the part is going to affect how the texture goes on it. So if you're ever trying to texture a part and the texture is going on in a way that you don't expect it to go on, or it's going on in a way that it's not supposed to go on, or you don't think it should go on, just check your part axis is what I'm getting at. Make sure your part axis is centered, or maybe it needs to be off or something. Notice if I come up here and go center axis to part, I redefine the part texture. In this case, it's not going to change a thing. Okay, so this texture went on really nice. All right, so that, that's kind of the basic stuff. And in the next video, I think we'll look at texturing all 6 sides of this cube to show you that you can put a different texture on all 6 sides. But I'll also show you ways that the program will kind of mess with your textures a little bit, and the ways to fix that. So lots of stuff still to come. We're still working with a basic cube here. And again, come see us in the forums if you have any questions, and we'll go from there.